The worst moment was right there, in front of everyone, when she pointed at me and said, "You are not leadership material." I had just finished warning about a risk tied to a $1,200,000 bonus, and the entire conference room went flat like someone had turned off the lights. I am Eliza. I was the senior underwriting analyst at Meridian Heritage Insurance, a mid-sized company that handled complex corporate policies. My team worked on a program we called Project Lighthouse. It was a 3-year product for a big client, Harborview Capital, and the contract had a $1,200,000 contingency bonus tied to hitting certain loss thresholds and documentation milestones. I spent months building the risk model. I ran scenarios. I printed spreadsheets with line items down to the dollar. I documented every call and every meeting in a file called Lighthouse Risk Log. I cared about the numbers because our underwriting accuracy shaped the company balance sheet and the client payout, and because I took pride in being the person who stopped bad surprises before they happened. My team lead was Maya. She was fast on her feet and ambitious. At first, she liked my work because I made her look decisive in quarterly reviews, but Maya had an edge. She needed to win now. She liked big headlines and leadership praise. Over time, I started noticing little things. She would cut off people in meetings. She took credit for decisions in front of the senior leaders. She bragged about closing deals without the details in place. She was the kind of person who believed confidence could substitute for due diligence. 2 weeks before the board was scheduled to decide about the Lighthouse contingency payout, I pulled a red thread through our numbers. A vendor we used for catastrophe modeling had changed the input parameters, and that created a 1.7% variance in expected loss. That percentage did not sound dramatic until you multiply it against the policy size. I ran the math twice. The outcome risked triggering the contingency bonus in a way that would reward the client $1,200,000, but leave the company exposed if claims spiked. I uploaded the detailed note into the Lighthouse Risk Log, labeled it critical, and sent an email to Maya with the subject line, "Lighthouse Risk Flag, critical input change, please review." I also added a calendar invite for an emergency review 1 day later. The invite showed up on Maya's calendar as owner, Maya Rivera. I remember the all-hands meeting clearly. It was in conference room 4C and streamed to the national offices. Everyone from legal to the chief executive officer was on the call. Maya started the section on Project Lighthouse with an upbeat slide and a half-hour of growth talk. When I tried to speak up and explain the variance during the question and answer, she brushed me off in front of everyone. She said, "We will circle back." After I pushed again, she straightened and said the line that stopped my breath, "You are not leadership material." She laughed like it was a joke, but it landed like a hand on my face. That moment changed everything. It was petty and public. It made people see me as the problem, not the warning source. Within days, the first escalation hit. The board voted to proceed with the contingency structure based on Maya's presentation. I did what I knew to do. I sent a follow-up to the legal team and the client with an attachment of the scenario outputs and a short note, "Lighthouse inputs need alignment." I copied my manager and Maya. The legal counsel responded with a question about timelines. Maya replied to legal and client with "Eliza is overcautious," and she removed me as the meeting owner on the calendar invite. I stared at that change in the calendar invite trail and felt the first real prick of fear. A week later, the second escalation occurred. An audit flagged reserve estimates for a different product line. Someone noticed a misapplied credit memo worth $450,000. It was not my work, but Maya used the opening to start an informal critique of the underwriting team in front of other managers. She began forwarding selective threads and saying things like, "We need ownership on these small errors." The tone implied that the underwriting group lacked rigor, and she used my earlier voice of caution as evidence. I sat in my office, breathed slowly, and typed a careful reply with attachments. I saved my draft before I sent it, and then I did not send it. I kept it. I made a copy and put it in a folder called Own Defense Audit Correspondence. Over the next 9 months, things stacked like a slow leak in a dam. Little problems compounded into bigger ones. There were 32 emails worth of problems in the trail by the time it all spiraled. That is not an exact science, of course, but 32 distinct threads landed in my inbox and the team inbox, each with a new claim, question, or misstep caused by a decision Maya had made without checking the Lighthouse risk log. One thread was about a misfiled endorsement that delayed a renewal. Another was a vendor invoice that did not match contract terms and cost the program an unexpected $25,000. There was also a client escalation where Harborview asked why our internal loss projection did not match their quarterly exposure report. Every time one of these issues bubbled up, Maya tried to keep the spotlight tight and pointed at someone else. The third escalation was personal. After the initial all-hands humiliation, Maya began excluding me from key client calls. She assigned me work, but removed me as the contact on the client portal. I had clear evidence of my original warnings. Emails sent, the calendar invite I had created that showed the sequence and timing, the Lighthouse risk log entries with timestamps. Yet public perception matters. Clients and senior leaders began to see me as a cautionary footnote rather than the analyst who had found the critical input change. I lost a promotion pipeline opening in month 5. The role went to someone on Maya's side of the team, and the rationale was a vague fit comment in the promotion meeting. I did not raise my voice. I took a breath, sent a brief thank you, and documented the conversation. I tried to be strategic and calm. When people would corner me in the hallway, I would smile and say, "I am working on it." When a peer tried to bait me into an argument during a staff huddle, I left the room quietly and documented the attempt in a personal note. I started keeping receipts of any expense or external meeting that related to Project Lighthouse. For a year, I had been the person who arranged a modeling review with the vendor called Shoreline Analytics, and I saved the invoices and the calendar invite trail for those meetings. I kept a log of every call, every draft, and every slide deck. I saved the 13-page contract addendum that showed how contingency payouts were to be validated. I printed a copy of the audit memo that should have been signed off by 2 named approvers. I did not flaunt these records. I kept them filed and labeled. Proof Trail Lighthouse. There was a low point at month 8. Harborview, frustrated, demanded a detailed explanation for the discrepancy between our loss projection and their numbers. The client account manager, pushed by legal, wanted answers and had looped in senior leadership. I was called into a small meeting where Maya and the head of client services were present. They asked me to explain the model in front of them. Maya interrupted and said, "We will handle the narrative. Eliza, take notes." I was downgraded to assistant note-taker in my own work. A week later, an internal message went out that I would be placed on an improvement plan for communication and stakeholder management. I remember the color of the performance plan document on the printer. It felt like sand being poured on my chest. I genuinely believed I had lost. My work was being erased. My reputation was collapsing with each forwarded email. Here is the unexpected detail that turned everything. Harborview kept meticulous records. They had their own audit trail, and they were better at documenting contract triggers than we were. When they escalated their concerns again, they sent copies of our correspondence to the chief executive officer and the legal director. They highlighted an email from 5 months earlier that had originally been sent to Maya and me, with Navy Point analytics attached. The client picked up the pattern. Our internal changes and vendor inputs did not align with the contract wording. The client asked for a joint all-hands troubleshooting call to go over the 32 threads and reconcile the gap. That meeting was scheduled for a Thursday and was an internal and external all-hands with the client. I had been gathering evidence silently for months. I had not told anyone. I had kept a folder on a secure shared drive called Lighthouse Evidence. It contained the Lighthouse risk log with timestamps, the calendar invite trail showing the order of meetings, the vendor invoices, the 13-page addendum, my saved receipts for outside consultations, and the 32 email threads that showed the pattern of decisions. One of the emails in that folder was a surprising twist, an internal dinner invoice from a vendor event that showed Maya had met with a vendor and had agreed to a parameter change without running it by the team. I had the receipt and the calendar invite for that dinner. It was a small detail, but it proved a bigger pattern. Decisions were being made off channels and then retroactively fitted into official communications. That dinner receipt was the kind of record many people forget to keep. I kept it. The all-hands was scheduled in Conference Room 1A and streamed to the executive suite and Harborview. Legal was on the call. The chief executive officer joined for the first 10 minutes. I entered the room and held my folder like a quiet weapon. I did not feel like a weapon. I felt like someone who had done her homework. The call started with the client laying out the 32 items that did not reconcile. They asked, "Who can explain the input parameter change from April?" Maya spoke up confidently. She began a long-prepared argument and then pivoted to say, "We had an internal discussion. The team signed off." The problem was, she claimed that the team had approved. I had the proof that the team had not approved. I let her talk. I took a breath. I did not interrupt. When the first pause came, I stood and asked the meeting moderator if I could share my screen. Legal looked at me. There was a beat where I felt 30 pairs of eyes. I said, "I want to show the timeline and the correspondence that led here." The moderator nodded. I opened the Lighthouse evidence folder and started with the calendar invite trail. I showed the emergency review invite that I had created 2 weeks before the board decision. The invite showed the date and timestamp and that it had been added by me. Then I pulled up the email thread with the vendor, Shoreline Analytics, where they reported changing the input parameters on April 21st at 7:15 in the morning. I clicked the message that Maya had forwarded later with an edited subject line. The client leaned forward. The chief executive officer frowned. I moved to the vendor receipt from the dinner. It was dated April 20th, and the payee name matched an external consultant who had no official role in the approval chain. I pointed out that the dinner invoice showed no team member other than Maya and the consultant. I said, "This is where the parameter changed outside our documented process." There was a quiet. Next, I opened the 32 email threads. I did not read every message. I highlighted the pattern. I clicked on the draft legal narrative that had my name in the header, but had been edited by Maya to remove my caution language. I displayed the version history showing that the narrative had been revised by Maya the night before a client meeting. The screen showed the timestamps. I said, "These timestamps show the sequence. The approvals were altered after decisions were made." Maya's face shifted. She first tried to deflect. She started to say, "That's not," but then legal asked a simple question. "Who removed Eliza as the meeting owner on the calendar invite?" Maya's mouth opened and closed. I showed the calendar history. It was subtle, but the metadata recorded a change. The room was quiet in a way I had never heard at Meridian Heritage. The chief executive officer asked, "Why was the approval handled outside the documented chain?" There was a moment where I could have asked for vengeance. I could have escalated loudly. Instead, I kept calm and pointed at one more thing. I opened my copy of the 13-page contract addendum and showed Clause 5.8 that set the contingency payout validation steps. Clause 5.8 required 2 named approvers and a validation report signed off by the head of risk. I said, "Clause 5.8 was not followed." I kept my voice steady. I did not raise my volume, then the hardest part happened. Maya stood and at first tried to explain. She hemmed and hawed, and then, with the client looking in the call and the chief executive officer watching, she said, "I handled it. I made the choice. I thought I was protecting the program and the timeline." Her voice cracked. She added, "I should have looped you. I should have followed the chain. Eliza was right." It was not dramatic. There was no shouting confession. There was a quiet admission that fell apart a little because she had to face the record. Legal took notes. The chief executive officer asked human resources to arrange a review. The client demanded remediation steps and a plan to reconcile the discrepancy before any contingency payout could be authorized. The meeting ended with a series of action items. The payoff felt deeper than simply being believed. The revenge I had quietly planned for 9 months was not about seeing Maya humiliated. It was about letting the documented truth force natural consequences. I refused to be dragged back into salvage mode for someone who had tried to erase me. When leadership asked who could lead the remediation team, Maya looked at me and said, "Can you step up?" She wanted me to fix the problem she had created. I sat for a beat and said nothing. I had built my proof trail partly because I wanted the company to act responsibly, not to rescue someone who had broken process. I told her, "I will help with a handover, but I will not be the one to clean this up on my own." She faltered. I explained calmly that the remediation required a cross-functional team and formal oversight because it involved client trust and legal obligations. Legal confirmed the need for a controlled plan. Human Resources and the chief executive officer agreed to a formal review. Maya was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. It was a painful outcome, but it came from her choices. A few weeks later, the Human Resources review concluded that senior management controls had been bypassed and that procedural lapses had harmed client trust. Maya was not fired the next day. That would have been dramatic and cheap. Instead, she was removed from the Lighthouse program. She was demoted from team lead to project manager, and a corrective development plan was put in place. The lesson reverberated in the office because the chief executive officer announced a tightening of approval processes and mandated training on the contingency clauses. The result for me was also measured. The company recognized my work publicly in a small meeting where the chief executive officer said, "We owe thanks to someone who followed process and documented risk." The client emailed an apology for the pressure and asked if I would consult on the reconciliation. I said yes, under a formal contract and oversight that ensured transparency. At the same time, a competitive firm reached out with a better offer to lead a risk team in their newly formed underwriting group. They had watched the record and liked that I had stayed calm and obedient to process when others did not. I accepted their offer and left Meridian Heritage 2 months later with a clean transition and a new role that had more responsibility and a title that reflected my contributions. There were 2 unexpected twists that I still think about. One was the dinner receipt. It was so small, but it showed a pattern of off-channel decisions. The other was how Harborview's own insistence on documented evidence pushed leadership to look closer. If the client had not audited as closely as they did, things might have stayed messy for longer. The 32 email threads that had once felt like a burden became the backbone of a public truth moment. I learned 2 things from it. First, always document and keep copies. Second, stay calm. When people roar, paperwork whispers the truth. I left with more than a new title. I left knowing that patience and careful evidence can turn a helpless moment into a fair outcome.